part of what MASB does is that we interact with academics, we interact with the measurement providers and agencies, we interact with the marketers, and then we interact with associations. And in doing so, we're often invited in to give presentations, like some are shorter, mini ones, some are longer ones, but we're invited in to give presentations through all these different types of organizations. And we thought it would be interesting to kind of show you one of the presentations that turned out to be one of the most popular ones. And it's called The 5 Compelling Reasons to Use Brand Preference. It's actually based on a strong work that MASB did starting back in, actually the project started in 2013, and the results that you'll see were, I believe, first published in 2015 accordingly. But it's been updated since then on some points. But this is one of our more popular ones, and it's especially popular within coming in, we're in business schools, where we're asked, hey, can you come in and talk to us about some aspect of metrics? What would you like, we'll leave it up to you. What would you like to talk about? And so oftentimes we'll talk about brand preference. So with that in mind, brand preference is a really interesting marketing metric. It's used in monitoring brand performance. So if you look at brand equity trackers, equity in quotes, because that can mean a lot of things, but brand trackers, you'll find oftentimes a brand preference concept in it. You'll also find it in television advertising, whether it be in a behavioral manner, a lab-based manner, or in a kind of a model where various metrics are modeled together to give an overall preference for a brand versus a competition. It's used in allocating media weight and deciding between individual executions or between campaigns based upon their relative strength. It's a key part of brand evaluations, which is where MASB first came up with the concept of it and going into brand valuation. So evaluation and valuations, if you look at the ISO standards, you'll see that those two are married together, where we're gaining the strength of the brand by the brand evaluations among the various stakeholders, including the customer's consumer base. And then brand valuations, the financial value of the brands. And in the brand valuation space, one of the key parts of the brand strength and this brand preference approach is, how do we have confidence in future cash flows? Because ultimately, when you're doing a brand valuation, oftentimes you'll look forward and then discount cash flows, expected future cash flows into the present. Well, how do we have confidence that those cash flows will materialize? We can't see in the future 100%, but we at least can get some understanding of, are we even in a position to deliver on those cash flows? So brand preference does all these jobs. So then the question has come up with, is it a valid measure? Well, why is it that this measure, this concept of brand preference, why has it elevated itself? So that's where we saw it, saw the problem, which is that, we better take this through the process. We better look at it, look at brand preference as a concept, and truly see if it has the strength to underline these different applications. So the first thing we do, as we often do in MASB, is like, well, hey, when we're talking about brand preference, what do we mean by that? And we have this wonderful thing called the marketingdictionary.org. And so this is the start of the definition for brand preference. So what is brand preference? It's one of the indicators of the strength of a brand in the hearts and minds of customers. Brand preference or brand choice represents which brands are preferred under assumptions of equality in price and availability. So in other words, for an individual consumers and then aggregated across consumers, and by the way, we use customers here as the broad term of customers, which includes both the people who are, involved with your brand and those who are involved with other brands. So it's the customers in a category. Which brands do they prefer over other brands if price and availability were taken out of the equation, if you controlled for price and availability? So that's ultimately what the brand preference metric is trying to do. It's trying to get at the heart of, hey, will they choose you? Ultimately. So to test this, we started the most ambitious project that MASB ever had. It actually ran for 18 months in the initial phase, but then it was extended by another year. So it actually ran for 2.5 years, but but the original trial data for this project, by the way, it's BIV. We love our acronyms in MASB historically. Joanna's been trying to break us of that. But BIV stands for Brand Investment and Valuation. So Brand Investment and Valuation Trials. So it ran for 18 months. It had 12 categories. So what we did is we interacted with 6 marketers, and we asked them, could you each bring forward 2 brands? And what we're going to do for that you're collecting data for, and their competitors. And what we're going to do is we're going to do this analysis. So we want you to sponsor in 2 categories, basically. They were mostly non-competitive. We had a couple participants who actually had some categories where they both were in, and so they divided it, and one took one, the other took another, and then they each brought a separate one as well. But they brought in these 12 categories, they each chose 2 categories, and so we had 12 categories overall, which, and across those categories, there were 120 brands. So there's 120 brands across 12 categories. They were very different. Some ran from a price perspective. The lowest price items was an average for the category of 30 cents. They were very focused on, spontaneous purchases. And then the other ones went all the way up to $35,000, which now would be more like $50,000 from back then in terms, where the decisions were very deliberative in nature and were made less often. And everything in between. There were some that had few competing brands, and there were some that were highly fragmented. There were some categories where they had weekly purchase cycles, to the others that had years of purchase cycle. And so all together, and some had influencers, and others were like a first no choice decision. So the customer and the consumer were the same person, whereas in others they had intermediaries, and the customer and the consumer may not have been the same person. So the person who bought may have been different than the person who actually used. And so we brought this together, and we asked the marketers if they could please share data with us. And so data which was shared was unit share, price, and distribution, and that came from each participant's provider. We had all of them involved. We had IRI, we had of course Nielsen. For automotive, we had a couple different ones that were involved, like Polk, JD Powers, and a few others. But we got the sales data in that those companies used to run their business. Then we had brand preference collected, and we actually worked with a company called MSW Research. So MSW Research has a brand preference approach, which is based upon choosing an item from a prize drawing. So consumers were exposed, and they were given the choice of, hey, we'd like you to participate in our piece of research. And as a reward for doing that, here's all these different categories. And we would like you for each of them to choose an item that you would want. And then we'll actually get those products and send them to you. So that's the mechanism. So it's a behavioral approach to brand preference. There are other approaches as well, but we chose to go with the brand preference by MSW Research. And then other marketing metrics. So awareness, consideration, loyalty, those type of metrics. We asked them to also provide from their own proprietary systems. And the people who were involved, we worked with on that was, Kantar, Millward Brown was a major source for that data. Ipsos was involved, and others, MSW as well. So there were others who were involved from there that we had that data. And we brought that all together. In the end, across these 12 categories and 420 brands, is that we had brand preference data for 7,200 consumers. So quite a robust sample size to draw conclusions on. Yeah.
Just one question on the MSW approach. When you say that this, the respondents basically can choose for each category, and then they are rewarded with that product. Is that what I'm saying?
That's correct. So they don't know that that's actually part of the survey themselves. So it's actually blinded to the participant.
So what does it work for the category with 35 stars?
So yeah, I can go into. So interesting enough, I'll give you an example for autos. In autos, what the prize drawing is actually a test drive. And so there are surrogate type of rewards that you can get accordingly. And when we get to search engines, we'll talk about that one a little bit. a bit more, because that's interesting how they implemented in it. But they came up with surrogates, and then what they do is they then validate it to actual in-market results to see how well those surrogate type approaches worked. But that's an example. So for other ones, for some like CPG goods, you're going to actually get the item itself. For other categories, they are related to what that purchase drive, because in auto, and Karen Eben, if she was here, she would talk in great details about that. The key thing that they're trying to do is get a test drive. And so that's
how I understand the logic, but probably I would test drive the one which I'm not able to afford.
Well, but then there's the we'll get to price and distribution equalization in a moment. And plus you're in that category, you're taking it out of a competitive set. So it's a defined competitive set, and those competitive sets are defined by price within that size. So there is some price equalization in the competitive set, but then there's also further ways to look at that. So, but it kind of at least gives you the idea, right? There's more details you can read this in the study.
I understand that you need to have some boxes. Those kind of things.
Yeah. Okay, so what are the results? Well, here are the 12 categories. The chart that will be on your left. I was in kindergarten. Okay, the charts that you will see on your left, you'll see that there were 120 brands, and what this was the brand preference results across those categories for each individual brand between brand preference and unit share over those 18 months. So this was a brand, this is a brand, this is a brand, and this is their brand preference, and that is their unit share. So if you just look straight across just brand preference to unit share, that's the relationship that you have. And you can also see it for each individual category. So here are the 12 categories broken out. By the way, the reason why you don't see the categories listed here is because we had promised the participants that would remain blinded. So blinded, but I'll show you some unblinded data from later studies afterwards. But these are the 12 different categories that the data came from accordingly. So obviously there's a strong relationship between brand preference, that interesting enough that the brands that people prefer happens to be the ones that they tend to also purchase. This is an additional category, some of the other fun categories that once the study was done, we had a whole slew of marketers come forward and say, hey, can you do that for my category? Can you do that for my category? Can you do that for my category? So we ended up doing a bunch of other type of studies based upon this. And you can see everything from credit card networks to search engines, casual dining restaurants, auto insurance, RX pharmaceuticals, which is very interesting as well. And you can see the relationships for those precisely. Now, the one I think is most interesting has to do with search engines, because search engines, you'll see the correlation ended up being 0.996. Anyone want to take a gander at what brand that was up there? Yahoo. Yeah, Google, of course, right? And so then Bing and the others, so you have to think back to 2015 brand-wise, which is kind of interesting because that's a category that has no price associated with it outside of your time to be involved with it, right? So that's a category where you have no, from that perspective, there is no price distinction between them, accordingly, and they're ubiquitous. So distribution is basically not a factor because you can pretty much have access to all of them. So this is some interesting type of data that came from it. Oh, and I don't have in this presentation, but what we did is we then took this and we also did price equalization. We put price and we put distribution into a model with it and tightened up the relationship even stronger, finding out that there were these exchanges that were going on within the category that had to do with availability of the product and also the price. Accordingly, price relative to the category average. And so that was a key finding. So that is where we get this top note of one of the compelling reasons that why brand preference has taken on this position is that higher brand preference equals more sales, or at least share, which then converts into sales through category size, right? So more preference, higher brand preference equals more sales. That's one of the reasons why it's become what many call a cornerstone metric, why it's one that's embedded in all of these different systems. Yeah.
Just a clarification, because I think we have a mix of people in the room. Are all these categories essentially primarily consumer categories? Or were there actual any B2B ones in here?
Oh, that's a good question. Let's see, we did have B2B, but but in the original 12, I believe they were all consumer.
Okay.
I don't recall
I
the
just want
B2B.
to put that as a caveat, because I can tell you this
Yeah.
doesn't translate to B2B the same way.
Well, there
It
were,
becomes a component, but not a strong enough solo component.
yeah, we do have some examples where it was done in B2B. They're not here on this one in particular, but there's another factor of a consideration. So what happens is kind of interesting is that brand preference, you get this consideration to brand preference scale, for lack of a better term. And so, so if you're not in the consideration set for a particular reason, then it doesn't matter that the influencers within you exist. So for example, if there's a restriction by purchasing department or by an executive that this company's out, well, then the decision is not going to be made by to that side.
Yeah, it's going into the multi-buyer environment. Like you
Yeah.
may,
And there is influencing for each buyer.
yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And multiple people
It's
within
simply
it.
much more
Yeah.
complex, but the models, the
concept's
premise still
the
says.
same.
The premise is the same, but it can't
It's
be,
the same, but it's a lot more complex.
Yeah, exactly.
it can't be the sole variable, which as opposed to in consumer, this can be a good enough sole variable. If you're trying to do like a quick shorthand, like if you're doing like a brand pull study and like you have very few questions to ask, you can use a brand preference question to derive the rest of the questions quite accurately.
Yeah.
But in a B2B study, you need to have, well, at least 3 independent factors,
Yeah.
including brand preference.
Yeah, now one of the B2B categories I remember was accounting services, which is generally it's one choice for the organization. And it is much more compartmentalized to a given department. As an example of one that this was proven out on, that clear.
Technically, the pharmaceuticals is also a B2B category.
In many respects, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's not OTC, it's prescription drugs, right?
Yeah, those are prescription drugs.
So B2B.
So
Physician
It would
prescribes.
probably work with small and medium-sized businesses, but not necessarily with the bigger ones. If you, depending on the size of the market, it might work.
It's the nature of the product too.
Yeah.
It works in winner take all categories.
Yeah.
It's much harder in a multi-vendor
Yeah,
environment, like in the same area of services or products.
yeah.
That's where it becomes a bit harder because like,
Things like business insurance or people like Sage Software
Yeah.
or
Oh, yeah.
Scott, things
Yeah.
like that.
yeah,
It would work in those sort of the smaller business thing, but not if you're buying electricity for a hospital grid.
Yeah, for small enterprises, it's actually implemented a lot for
It's
small
very
enterprises.
simple.
Can I add something to this?
Yes.
I think it might be valuable. I didn't know you were going to presenting this, actually changing circumstances. But we did go and run, a brand preference versus brand exclusive exercise in the coffee category. And what was very interesting to go and see was the commercial limitations of pursuing brand exclusive buyers. So this is between Starbucks, Dunkin', McAfee, versus people who consume the category heavily and had a brand preference where most of the purchases went, but not the exclusive purchases. And in that, it was a much closer tie-in to the present, future, and trailing financial performance of each brand in the category.
Yeah.
So this is why, like, this is a very good shorthand to understand how performance is, just to kind of add an extra flavor.
Yeah, well, I will say for categories like this is casual dining, so this was done as a one choice up, out of that segment. But there is a broader restaurant category, which is often done, that is actually a dollar allocation. You can actually do a multi-choice brand preference exercise, and so it becomes a percent of either dollars,
Yeah, the
of
wallet
currency.
share.
Yeah, wallet
Category
share
wallet
type
share,
of thing,
yeah.
or it becomes a share of choices.
Yeah, it's interesting with Starbucks because it won both dollar share and volume share for the majority of the market.
Yeah.
But it's still has the minority of category volume.
Yeah, it's one of those strange ones, right?
Yeah.
So let's go to the reason number 2, and that has to do with the research. Oh, maybe I do have, nope, I do not have my price to show you it from model form. But one of the reasons why brand preference is in there is because of this interaction with price and distribution. In this case, we'll talk about price because it gives the marketers the different levers to pull. So say, for example, that you have brand preference, we're going to call it X. You have brand preference X, and you do a powerful marketing campaign, and you grow your brand preference to Y. So imagine this line is Y. You then have your choice on how you get the value out of that brand preference. You can, for example, keep your price exactly the same and have it turn into share. So that's one option. Or you can actually increase your price, which is there's a lot of brand preference exercises going right now with the inflation side to see how much they can increase their price by and keep the same share. So it's like we're going to keep the share, but we're going to, raise our price, therefore increasing margins. And the third alternative, of course, is you can do any combination of those as well. So that's one of the things for brand preference is that because it drives, when you get someone to prefer, they will prefer you, they will tend with a price increase, they will intend to stick with you during a price increase. So that's the key consideration of why brand preference is used. And this is a classic case study, one of the earliest, let's see, it was published in 2004, but I believe the data, yeah.
One quick question on the price curve. How did you account for the perception of brand that price has, right? So when you price higher, you could have a higher premium perception of the brand versus you price cheap, they would, it could be a perception that the brand is slipping or is becoming a non-exclusive brand. Right?
Yeah, which is often termed the absolute vodka effect.
Yeah.
Where you can actually raise your price and actually grow share accordingly. And what will happen in those cases is that when you do that exclusivity, they're usually by some type of marketing campaign supported. You actually are growing your brand preference as you are building that esteem. So that price valuation, we'll see it a little here on price perception.
Mm-hmm.
Price perception actually can drive brand preference. So you can actually use that kind of positioning to actually grow brand preference to become more exclusive. And so brand preference is often, well, I'll show you a slide here, but it's often called the vacuum cleaner because it takes all these different factors and rolls them into it. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, so if brand preference is an indicator of equity, I feel that equalizing across price and availability shouldn't be there. Because what a higher equity brand does is willingness to pay the higher price, willingness to go seek it out, even if it's not easily available, right? Drive another 5 miles to go to my favorite grocery store or pay a higher price because I know I'll find all the things I like. So aren't you taking out some of the essential components of equity when you say, let's equalize price and availability?
Yeah, I think the idea behind equalizing price and availability is you have the situation where there's a lower price item and there's let's say a higher price competitor where the individual actually prefers this price, but they buy down, right? And so what we're trying to do by the equalizing of the price, you can still, they aren't preferring this product, the lower price product over this. Their preference is still for this product, but the price is driving them to choose here. However, if you get enough of a brand preference in it, you can avoid that buy down behavior. So that's the idea behind that. And so when you're equalizing for price, what we're basically saying is that we're looking at what the person's preferred, but when they're making their choice selections, in reality, in real life, they're adding that price in and that's making the choice.
I think partly, again, your dependent variable was unit volume or unit share.
Yeah.
If it had been dollar share, then we are kind of accounting for that, right? Like
Yeah.
I not that many people prefer it, but those who prefer it is paying that extra dollar. And are you winning on that dimension becomes the answer we are telling.
But can I
Yeah.
build on what you're saying?
Yeah,
I think
you will
I-
get a stronger relationship with
I think I'm
Dollar
kind of
Tree.
following where you're going. I think what is important to, if people are like new to this topic is brand preference is an interaction shorthand with the buyer base. The composition of what drives brand preference is unique to each category.
Yeah.
Right? So if you're just going and saying, oh, our brand preference went up, but you don't know what the components of brand preference are, it's actually not a very useful metric.
Yeah.
Right? So I think that's kind of what you're alluding to as well, because if your business objective is, I want to go and increase my margin per transaction, which is a dollar share exercise, you would be looking at different components of brand preference that you'd be emphasizing or wanting to change in the market versus if you're wanting to get unit share. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but not useful from a strategy standpoint, but highly useful from a tactical standpoint. So for example, if I have a particular ad and I do pre-post testing with brand preference, and I see the brand preference rate, I know even on why I might not yet understand because I have to look across multiple ads to try to get an analyst, I still know that that ad is going to move brand preference, which is going to move share, which is going to move sales. So from that tactical standpoint, it's still highly useful, even though I don't know what's driving that brand preference.
Very good.
So and this is an interesting case study from the 1980s, starting there, and tracking it over quite a few years, where you had these two batteries, Eveready and Duracell, and they actually started at the same place in terms of units. You can see over here on the side, they started about the same place. In fact, Eveready was a little higher. But then what happened is that Duracell and Eveready got into advertising competition. And so really, there's a lot of different parts of this case, which we don't have time to go into today, regarding different type of elements within the advertising and lawsuits and all sorts of interesting things. But the key thing is that the preference changed from the Duracell ads versus the Eveready. Well, Duracell has stronger ads. They generated more preference. So this is an average of what each individual ad had in terms of brand preference. And so you could actually see their brand preference actually grow over time, and where the brand preference for Duracell became much stronger. And correspondingly, they decided to take it in two different positions. They decided to take it both in market share and also in a price increase, whereas Eveready actually had a slightly lower price. They kept it nearly the same, but there was a slight price decrease during this time. And by the end of this time, where they started off at nearly the same place, they had profits of 609 million versus 275 million. So that's over 10 years. So this brand preference, the value of brand preference grows over time. And what's really interesting about this case is that they actually ended up both being sold. So the brands ended up being sold. And the Duracell brand sold for $8 billion and the Eveready brand sold for $3 billion. So these are big from, you talk from the tactical perspective on the ad side, all the way to the strategic, to the ultimately the financial market perspective. You can see the value of brand preference. So this is another point. Number 3 is that brand preference is the most predictive measure. So looking across that study, they also looked at quite a few others. I want to say we had 140 different other metrics which were included. But there was a group of about 60 that all the different participants actually were asking questions on. And the top of those were an unaided awareness, a brand loyalty type metric, a value metric. So value is that price perception metric, purchase intent, brand relevance, awareness. This is an aided awareness where the name was shown. The other before they would be unprompted, they would provide the name of brands they were aware of in the category. And then advocacy, which is a recommendation type metric. They would recommend to others. And I should say brand relevance would be, for example, an equity statement like X is a brand for people like me. X is a product category for people like me. That's what's meant by brand relevance. And what was interesting is that all of these metrics on this list here actually showed pretty strong variance explanations to that unit share, except that, or not except that, but that brand preference had the strongest of them. Also, brand preference was the one that was most consistent across them. on the correlation side. And I should mention, we only have this data for 6 categories. But you can see on the 6 categories, you can see it for the others. Unaided awareness also was one that was highly consistent, with 4 out of the 4 that we have the data for available on it. So you can see that all of these measures, they're all measuring some component, they're all measuring some element, which is important for marketers to take into account. But brand preference was the strongest. But this is where we got into a little more interesting side, is that what we also found was that the relationship to brand preference and to unit share. So you can look at this awareness unaided. The variance explained was 52%. So awareness explained 52% brand preference, 48% in unit share. Brand loyalty was 50-45, 41-32, 33-27, 28-19, 28-18, 23-15. So what this was showing was that the brand preference, that these metrics were actually were influencing the brand preference measure, but the brand preference measure itself had a variance unexplained between brand preference and unit share. And when you take that into account, these relations, that's why these are lower. That explained why these were lower.
Frank, actually, could you go back to the previous slide for just 1 second?
Yeah.
Yeah. Doesn't that have implications for the validity of the famous and overused NPS, Net Promoter Score?
Yeah.
Doesn't that imply it's bottom?
Yeah, in fact, most of these were Net Promoter Scores. So in fact, I want to say that of the ones that we had, that was, I think 3 of the 4 were in the exact formulation of Net Promoter Score. According to
And-
but,
NPS is a negative metric on future valuation. It has a negative relationship.
oh, that's interesting.
That would
If
be
you take
interesting to see.
NPS over 5
Yeah.
years,
Yeah.
it does not predict future increases. in
I'd love to see that then.
We actually see that, there is this positive, we found a positive relationship, and it was, while the correlation wasn't, as strong.
Let me rephrase it. NPS from 5 years ago, your score 5 years ago did not predict valuation 5 years later. If you tracked it and NPS was going up or down,
Correspond.
then you were able to predict a range of valuation. But a point in time NPS was not a predictor of a future valuation.
Yeah, it's more of a
Because it's
predictor of.
highly experience-based metric, right?
Yeah.
And experience varies over time.
Yeah,
And it's also
convenience measure.
participation,
Yeah.
penetration of NPS is a problem. If you have a very small percentage of your buyer base
Correct.
sharing the NPS data with you,
Yep.
you can get a very
Yeah, you
false
can be
positive.
biased.
of
And
NPS.
again, you are looking largely CPG,
Yeah,
not exclusively, and NPS is not that great a metric for CPG categories, and people
Yeah.
don't advocate.
Frank, I want to ask you, what about house brands? I mean, we're not talking about P&G or those. If you go to some of like Costco, whatever, you'll see house brands and they're stacked against a premium brand. But I'm noticing because of inflation now, that shoppers are going with the house brand.
Mhm.
And how does it stack up during these
They're
challenging
still
times?
brands.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so they were
They're
treated
equally
as,
brands.
yeah, they were.
There's no such thing as something that doesn't have a brand.
I think he's asking on the methodology side of how they were included. And
Yeah.
so if they were the larger ones, for example, the Great Value brand for Walmart or a Costco, brand like a Kirkland type one, they were included as a brand because that's how consumer interacts with them. But there was actually an additional placard that was included, your favorite other brand. And that had to do a lot with, like, for example, in the snacking categories where they have a lot of regional favorites. So they're not necessarily control brands or store brands, as you're saying, but they're regional favorite brands. So that was actually captured in there, that they actually did allow people to choose your favorite other brand.
The other question I have for you, Frank, is I noticed now that they have twofers with certain brands. How does that stack up against another brand? Like you're getting a discount by buying 2 of the same brand versus a competing brand where it's only one item. How does that stack up in terms of brand preference?
Yeah, so there are different ways within the mechanism that you can equivalize if you want to. So sometimes they are done, so basically you try to get as near packaged as possible. So the options that they're giving is near packaged as possible. Another option is actually to, and this is for rare categories, and I don't think anywhere in this particular study, but just to address the point, sometimes you'll do a logo and then, for a certain brand rather than a package size. And then they'll be told that they're going to get X amount of it. That makes sense for that category.
Yeah, if you look at what consumers do, consumers basically do the averaging. They're if any experienced consumer, they look at a BOGO, for example, what they're doing is they're figuring out what the average price is. And so to a large extent, it's a wash.
Yeah, so it's more just how do you represent it within the collection mechanism, I think.
And the consumers, again, experienced consumers are really bright. And I've done some work in the pharmaceutical arena. People actually will tell you, oh, I compute the cost per dose.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So anyway, so we get this effect where these other associations, if you will, or other type of metrics drive brand preference, which then drives the unit share. Another fourth option, element of this was brand preference creates real options. That by growing your brand preference, you can then leverage that into other segments and in completely different categories. I think it's kind of interesting today if you ask people what an Apple is, 15 years ago, they would say Apple is a computer brand. Go back 7 years, it's all about the iPod, right? It was all about the handheld and then the smartphones and so on. And now, it's more about the other items which get delivered to them overall. So it's really about real options is that when you have a strong brand, you're able to leverage it into other areas to expand your horizons. And of course, this chart's a little dated because it's obviously from that time period. But Apple continues to expand and to actually create new brands for further expansion accordingly. And so all of this came together and was put together into a model called the MASB brand investment valuation model, which was actually used as part of the ISO brand standard that we talked about. It's been used heavily in a variety of different ways, but there's mathematics that underlines all of this, that connects all of this, that you can find in the white paper, that talks about how brand activities and also your competitor's activities, because your brand preference is impacted by what your competitor does, that those activities then drive customer brand strength, which from different associations, which then lead to brand preference or choice. That then has an effect on market share. It has an effect on price. Interesting enough, it has an effect on distribution. There are retailers right now who are doing brand preference exercises to determine if there are products that they should put on their shelf that currently are not on their shelf. So they have data, extreme amounts of data on the brands that they stock. They don't have the data on the brands that they don't stock. So they want to get those brands on their shelf so that people don't go to a different retailer to find the brand that they want. So brand preference is used in that particular way. So it has an effect on distribution. So then, so it drives these factors. Then, of course, you have category size come in. Then you have this market share and category volume leads to your velocity. The price aspect leads to your margin, which goes to your operating cash flow. And that, along with any chances for real options, extensions, brand extensions is another way to put real options, then comes out and leads to a brand value. And so the brand preference measure is a way, by knowing that if you have a strong brand and that brand is strong among younger age demographics, you know that you have a greater chance of carrying over your cash flows into the future. And so that underscores the whole idea on brand valuation is how do we know this cash flow going into the future? Edgar, that's kind of the way that they do it. They look at the younger consumers, kind of a customer lifetime value equation put the other way. They look at it and will say, okay, so we can have confidence in these cash flows because we have strong brand preference, including among our younger consumers.
Gonna add to that, that is such a critical distinction that you just went and put in. You have to look at it based on age cohorts or buying cycle cohorts, because I don't know if you folks are familiar with Kraft Heinz is when they IPO'd after being taken private, they actually did the most comprehensive brand valuation exercise of their portfolio that was in the public domain. I think it was like the largest exposure that was there. But the problem is that from everything I have come to know, they looked at the average brand preference across all age groups
And they're
and
ruining
they
it.
projected it into the future.
Yeah.
And rather than looking at the fact that they had a huge bias towards older people, and as those people started passing away, the younger generation did not have the same brand preference, and they have to now write off, I think, nearly 40 to 50% of their brand valuation that was conducted in 2015.
What brand was that again?
The Kraft Heinz portfolio, so
Oh,
they're not
right.
disclosing what it was by each individual brand,
Yeah.
but that was the flaw in the way they conducted the brand
And it
valuation.
was, I can tell you, it was cereals.
Well, to that end, let's take cereals. You mentioned brand preference and the ability to raise prices when a consumer still picks that one versus another on the shelf. Well, you've got all the products now are getting smaller.
Yeah.
And keeping the same price. Yeah. Right? So you were talking about pharmaceuticals earlier. People are now looking at the volume of the box and comparing prices. So where's that brand preference and the breaking point where someone says, I'm done buying General Mills, they keep shrinking their boxes.
Yeah.
Right? And I'm getting half of what I used to for the same price.
Yeah, so shrinkflation is a very interesting concept. There is, in addition to brand preference, there is a tool that was, I believe, came from ComScore, who actually licensed the same technology that MSW uses, where they actually have a buy down and a shrinkflation questionnaire
Yeah.
that goes along with the brand preference that gets to that. And so it's kind of interesting because they have it broken down by category, how susceptible people are to leave brand preference. So it's kind of like an elasticity tied to brand preference. And interesting, there are some categories where which had proven more resilient. Like one that comes to mind was, I believe, was like blue jeans, like denim clothes. And because the main factor there was quality, and so if quality is a major deciding factor, then it's more sticky. If the quality between the brands is less so, then it's a category where they're more apt to go. And so they did exploration, so brand preference was their baseline. And then this was decomposed into, to look at shrinkflation, to look at inflation, price size accordingly. So it's a really good if you have to Google it. Oh, by the way, I should mention that we can get you the base study for brand investment valuation directly from the MASB site, but then we also have done multiple presentations and publications of these. And so so those are all hosted by Work. So shout out to Work. So if you can go to Work and see the other data underlying this there. So did that get to it?
It did. I have one other point I was gonna, and again, I know this is consumer. But if you look at B2B, for example, and the longer buying cycles, reputation plays a big part too.
That's right.
So you have,
Brand is
Each
reputation.
brand.
Yeah,
exactly,
same thing.
same thing.
well, but then my question to a group of marketers, because I lead communications, right? And then I work with the marketing teams, I work with the branding teams. All of our work feeds into the brand ultimately, right? But if you have a strong brand and a strong technical product, but people lose trust in you, or you're not a company they want to associate
That's part of
themselves
brand,
with.
that's part of.
It is, but how do you break down reputation as a key part of the brand? How would you define that?
Well, I would say that, I would define reputation. I think the split between corporate communications and brand communications does not exist in reality. It was an artifact.
Yeah.
And I think social media accelerated its disappearance so that there never was any difference. Now it's becoming more obvious because what does your brand, particularly because of, social justice and it being good reputation, the purely, what do people think of the company aspect is become much more important component of the brand.
Yeah.
But you can look at this, we actually did this for major telecoms company. Some time ago, we split, we actually looked at corporate reputation metrics, separate from brand metrics, separate in their minds and organization.
Yeah.
And, so you were able to look at both separately, but a distinction is gone. It's what people think about how the company behaves, how it treats the employees of a whole, is a major part of perceptions of the brand, tries to brand. So it should be included. You break down, what is the value of the brand into what are the aspects of the brand that drive it, behaviors of corporate.
But I will say that legacy there, I mean, legacy cost is a real thing in B2B. There is a cost of moving away from your current provider, regardless. And so I think you got that whole, the reputation aspect and the cost aspect rolls into, so you end up being, hey, they prefer us. We've done good marketing to this particular entity. They prefer us, but not yet to the point where they're willing to take on that cost. However, if something goes bad, you're going to be the first person on the call.
It's experience driven, right? It's an experience economy. If the experience is bad, you'll incur the expense to change because you're not going to feel the pain.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think it goes to the discussion about the two concepts of customer equity or relationship equity. We're referring to B2B, so basically reputation is relationship equity. And brand equity is more product-based, based and focused on this. And I think there's no way to say that these two concepts are orthogonal to each other. It's we can understand relationship equity is something that feeds into brand equity. So there's positive spillovers. The brand becomes just stronger because you have a good reputation of the company. But it's also the other way around. You do not have some equity in terms of the products you sell, then it also hurts your relationship building. Sure. And in that sense, it's an interesting exercise. But it's very academic in the sense that we try to separate something which is not appearing in separate forms. So it's something like a Heisenberg relation.
And it's really interesting with turnover when you have leaders, you have existing leaders and you have new leaders come into an organization who have experience with different entities, and then they start having these conversations, with different perspectives, right? So there's that role that we can't. We can't think of in B2B, we can't think of the entity as being monolithic. It's the people who are in the organization who are ultimately making those decisions, and how, it can be a spectrum among them. And that's, as you said, was more complicated to parse out. But is there,
I like the pathway, right, from brand strength or preference to brand value. That makes sense, but what I'm hearing a lot of lately, and we've seen some examples of that, is that brand strength or brand preference may not be stable, and it's not because of the right hand, it's because of brand activities very rapidly. So, Scott Galloway recently said it, but he didn't say it out of a vacuum. It's really plenty of proof out there in the markets that experience and product can turn brand preference on its end overnight, right? So if the idea here is that there's brand stability, then everything on the right makes sense. How are you guys addressing, or is there something happening to address the idea that brand preference and brand strength may be more tensile than it ever was before?
Yeah, so you really have to monitor it. So that's what part of it comes down to, the brand evaluation and these brand trackings, where it's just so critical that you're monitoring what's going on and then having to respond to it. But, I mean, we have seen circumstance, and we've been quite open in conversation. For example, we did a series, which we had in our last time on the Bud Light situation and what has happened in their brand preference. So it is one of those things where you really have to monitor it. You have to watch for danger signs, put in trackers, and a lot of the tracking side, nowadays you can have alarms, if you will, that if it falls without a certain range, it's less likely to be statistically, a statistical variation, and then that's a signal for your team to come into it. So I think the underlying part is that it's no sure thing in the future, but instead it goes to responsibility and accountability on the part of us as marketers to ensure that we're monitoring this for our organizations, that we're being proper stewards of the brand, which includes understanding the brand preference or how the brand relates to the other entities, and being vocal about that when things don't seem to be going right. You gotta take swift action.
But I mean, there's a follow-up to that though, and this is academic, and I realize it may not be an easy answer to this. But if the idea of brand value is some sort of expected value of all the options and different variations that are happening here, right? If your core of where it starts, which is brand strength, if that in of itself has now become riskier and potentially more downside risk than upside risk by doing something wrong, doesn't that nature of riskiness at the very front end affect the brand value? Are brand values automatically all going downward because they're in a riskier brand?
That's exactly what Frank was saying, that's what it does. If you look at the work that Jim Meyer and Frank have done on the Bud Light, they've taken it down. It's a very clear example, it's so extreme. They've taken it down with the fact that it's just action, misguided action, talking about politicizing brands with social justice. That's why people are pulling back from it. If you get it wrong and do not react right, you can destroy the value of your brand and your business. That's exactly what's happening.
Well, that's not what I'm quite referring to. What I'm referring to isn't after the fact of what you might have missed the boat or you did something that would hurt the brand. It's the idea of itself that if brand has become more tenuous to hold on to, if it's a more competitive environment, before you even do anything negative to your brand by accident, the value of brand might just be decreasing because on the front end, the very source of that, which is brand preference, is become more tenuous, right? So I wouldn't pay, if I had a house that somebody said has gone on a fault line, I'd pay less, right? Despite the fact that that house offers me multiple options. If that house is on a fault line, there's a problem, right? And that's what I'm kind of getting to.
You're right. This is not a risk-adjusted model.
Yeah,
And you could
This is
put,
why you should risk adjust every brand valuation.
but you could incorporate risk into this. But what
Yeah.
you see here is not risk-adjusted. And you're absolutely right. And certainly in some categories, that brand preference has become more volatile.
and I just kind of want to build on it, because you went to raise the whole concept of value. And we got to be very, very clear on what we know and mean by value, because value has a very diverse set of definitions. Like, are you going and taking a look at balance sheet value? Are you looking at monetary value? Are you looking at value from the perspective of the buyer? So that the use of definition of value here does become very critical, because one way to look at it and look, this is a framing, right? This is a stripped down abstraction of a lot of different variables to help you navigate a complex environment. But brand value, this is whether the brand as a value driver has a meaningful impact on the organization. Are you changing it as an impact? So view it as a change in dependency on the brand as a value driver. The actual financial value has so many other factors into it, right? Like, you go and change interest rates and the value of the company overnight changes, not because of anything the company did, but because of associated interest rate premiums or discounts that are bound to apply, right? So I think it's better to go and use it from a point of view of value leverage rather than absolute financial value. Does that help?
Yeah.
That's a very important, like, it's what gets people trapped. Like, they're like, oh, like, what's my brand value? And like, oh, $10 billion. Well, it's like, oh, but what you're really looking for is, how do I increase the value of my brand?
So let me show you a chart that is actually used by.
I would make one more comment, just to make things more complicated.
Yes.
If you're gonna compute brand value based on future cash flows, brand value is now gonna be influenced by the interest rate.
Yes.
Yeah, well, and that's included in
Yeah.
the financial value of brand calculation.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you look at the actual math, with discounting back. But here's an actual example to get directly to your point. This is actually from a MASB member. It's been blinded, because because at the time it had a very specific issue going on. But this is an example where they're looking across a portfolio of brands. These are 3 examples that they pulled from it. The way they looked at it is like, look, I have brand A. It's in a category, the broad category is flat, but the segment that it's in is growing. The brand preference is very strong. And the pricing is in line with the competition for the segment. The distribution is strong, they had extremely strong distribution channel. And the leverage is strong, in this particular case. This is not the right brand. This is just done as an example. So what they came back with is that our assumption is that this is going to be growing slowly and sustainable. So then when they did their discounted cash flow analysis, they were happy to use a 10-year, the CFO and the vice president of finance worked together and came up and said, for that particular brand, we're going to accept the cash flow out 10 years. And we're going to have a terminal value at the end, a residual value to add into it. And so their investment implication was that we're going to invest high and increasing in that. Then they have brand B, which was growing, and it was growing with both the broad and the segment were growing. So it was it was a hot new segment, if you will. And they said, well, we got to participate in that. Look, the dollars are coming up. But what they found is that the brand preference among younger consumers was falling. And they said that, their pricing was in line with the competition, distribution was strong. They didn't know if they could leverage it further, the brand any further. And so they said that the cash flow was likely unsustainable. And so they refused to assign a brand value to it. They just refused and said, we're not going to assign a brand value to this. And we're going to start to curtail the amount of money that we're investing behind it. So this is that interaction between marketing and between finance, where they're using the preference as one of the components for making a strategic decision. But you're absolutely right. If they don't have confidence in that brand preference, then you can get things like that going on. So, yeah. One more. Yes.
Maybe also to make things more complicated.
Oh, go ahead. We love complication.
Yeah, it's one job. But what I think what we still haven't understood very well is also the implication that brand preference as a proxy for brand equity or strength of the brand is having for investments and for costs. Because if you have a strong brand, it also means that you need to invest into the brand. There's a certain commitment required to that. Otherwise, you just will lose the strength over the next years with some time lag. But that requires that you are willing to do so. Right? But at the same time, I believe it's strong brand is also has an advantage in terms of the return on marketing investments. So the return is typically better, but it also requires a larger investment. There's one example, and maybe you remember that when Kaspar Rohrstedt became CEO of Findley, he was very much driven by the financial markets and cut back a lot of marketing investments. So, and we moved on to Adidas, and you know what's happening at Adidas at the moment. And because at Henkel, they realized that after that, these years serving the financial markets, they pushed the stock price by just cutting back the investments, but they actually did not understand that there was a commitment required, an obligation to keep the investment level high enough level for the brand to make sure that you're also sustainable in how you compete in the marketplace. Because those put on some traditional relations to that company, they are still cleaning up what happened during these years, and that shows the challenge and the question that I'm asking. I don't have the answer, but how can I determine and use those concepts such as brand preference or brand strength? What is the required investment that I need to make sure is there to be able to show to CFOs, to financial guys, especially in those times when times get harder, because cash is less available, just to make sure and to prove that you need to have that minimum investment, otherwise you risk getting into trouble with the company at some data point.
I think that you should join. You should, that best, right? Because that's exactly what it's tackling. And it's what we in my consulting role we tackle all. It's all about how do I link my brand to future business value, and what level of brand, how do you take that in a competitive, evolving competitive environment, as long as it depends on how much competitors are investing, and come up with a really,
Yeah, and we do have a paper on this that Dave, Kelly Johnson of Disney, let's see, Doug Crane of MSW Research and I wrote that actually went into that in some point. We actually looked at brand preference from the perspective of maintaining and delivery. So we basically put the GRPs, growth rating points, and brand preference together to get a weight on maintaining share. It was interesting, if you go dark on average, you see within a quarter, you see a 0.4 share gain loss if you go completely dark. But we've actually, there's a model that you can use these concepts with and actually project out what you need to do to maintain share instead of grow. So we can get you that as well. But I think,
I just wanted to say, the IPA have done quite a bit of work on going dark.
Yep.
Particularly, obviously, in recession times, and it's also not a bit. I think as an industry, we tend to focus on on the good times and going how much more we can get, and we don't talk about the implications of cutting, and the implications of how much you will fall and the cost of getting back to where you were, which is more sometimes than actually just maintaining where you were.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think we've done studies in the past which have shown that going into a recession, the brands that panic stop spending.
Yeah.
Not only does their value go down, the value of the brand and the business go down more, it takes much longer to come back than the recession.
But plus also, if everybody else is pulling off, it's often cheaper, right?
Yeah.
So it's
Sure.
cheaper to maintain. You can reduce the cost of your marketing by 30-40% by just carrying on, and therefore getting a higher saliency, which will help you on the upturn.
that's right. It costs much less to get that share of voice within that category of all your
Cost of
competitors.
share of voice is
Walk
much
off the
lower.
battlefield. Yep.
What I mean, it's amazing. We have lots of research looking at these situations in a recession, what happens, and when you stop doing marketing and so on. But what I have more in mind is what we don't have so far is really a structural approach to use the brand measurement of the brand preference, strengths, etc. In a way to tell you how much you need to spend to link it, especially with expenditures, with investments in the future years.
Yeah, and you require different additional calculation.
Yeah.
That's so integrating all that
Because
knowledge.
you've got to have the competitor in the market.
I mean, share of voice will get you quite a long way. It's actually much harder to calculate. I mean, you still got a lot more about that than 7 stars, but it's more complicated to calculate now.
Yeah, just to build on that. So I work for a media agency. We do have a way of getting to that number, so we don't base it on preference, base it on either awareness or consideration, just because we have access to YouGov data and they're the metrics that they have. But we basically have about 10 years worth of brand spend data, 10 years worth of brand index data, and you're able to kind of triangulate from that what's the minimum spend you need to hit in order to keep your brand equity at a flat line. And obviously that will vary quite a bit, depending on how well distributed you are, what category you're in, et cetera, et cetera. But you can kind of help that data value, get a prediction that's specific to whatever brand you're trying to recommend a budget for. So it's definitely not a perfect answer, but that's kind of how we do it in our agency.
And there's an additional shade there, right? It's not any spend, it's
Right.
brand building spend, which is what,
Yeah.
which is the first thing that they would cut.
Which with quality creative, right? So
Yeah,
with quality
exactly.
creative,
It's quality
which they say
creative.
is non-working.
Yeah, not just what you spend,
Yeah.
but what you say is so critical, yeah. and
Yeah.
obvious.
So, well, we've reached our time on this discussion, but I hope that gives you kind of a little view of the, we're going out and doing this with many, many entities. If any of you would like us to zoom in for a session, let us know, but this is what we do. So with that, I'll end and say it's time for another break.